Well, hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. Before we get started today, just a reminder, especially to those of you that are new to this channel, everything we do here is for the DIY home mechanic. It is not for the professional mechanic or for professional use. And the tools that we'll be using are going to be regular DIY tools from your regular hardware store. If I use any professional tools, it's because there's no other option. So if you're a professional mechanic who's watching this video, please don't write in and say, hey, did you know you're supposed to use Mitsubishi specialist tool number blah 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 for $300 a piece. That's not what this channel's about. This is purely to help the home mechanic to get the job done as cheaply as possible in his own garage. So with that said, a couple of other quick things. From time to time during my videos, you're going to be jacking the car. I'm not a health and safety expert, and I'm not really going to be giving much in the way of advice on how to jack your car and safe methods of doing work on your car. So please make sure you read up wherever you need to on the best methods for doing what you're doing safely. And a couple of other things, just some updates really. If you've been following this series of videos, you've seen me doing a lot of work on a black car. I'm presently respraying that black car, and then as soon as the respray's finished, we'll start a whole new series of videos on spraying techniques that I've used on that car and how to put the car back together, every last nut, bolt and washer. So I hope you'll be looking forward to that. Now, I think that's about it on the things I was... Oh no, sorry, one other thing. Please don't ask questions on the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel, you're welcome to leave comments on. I will read the comments from time to time, but please don't request videos on the YouTube channel or ask me any questions on the YouTube channel, because I just don't have the time to be there for everyone all the time to go back through hundreds and hundreds of messages. If you want to send me a personal message or request anything, please go to my forum. It's on the t-shirt, I think, and we'll also put it up on the screen for you. The forum is purely to complement this channel. I'm well aware that there are lots and lots of really good forums out there for those of you that are into these cars, and please stick with those forums. In fact, I'd like you to promote those forums on my forum. I'm not trying to take anyone away from other forums. It is purely to complement this channel and to contact me directly and to talk to other people about things that we're doing on this YouTube channel. So with that said, we'll now look at today's video. Now in today's video, we're going to be looking at replacing the front wheel hub bearing. Now this is pretty much a DIY job. There are a few non-standard tools we're going to have to use, but I'll make it as simple as possible using the easiest and cheapest possible tools. Perhaps not the right tools, but they will still get the job done. Now, the wheel bearing in the front comes as a complete hub assembly, and we'll look at that individually in a minute. First of all, we'll look at where it goes. So this is your drive shaft for your front wheel. Comes through your CV joint. Then you've got your hub. And then inside the hub, mounted from this end, is the bearing assembly. Now to look at that in more detail, I've got one here that I've already taken apart. Here is your front wheel ABS speed sensor. You shouldn't have to actually remove that to do the job, but I've removed it for ease of filming. Your hub itself would be sitting this way up with your steering arm on here and your suspension mounted here, and your brakes would be mounted here. Here's that CV joint. If we undo the bolt on the end, we can remove the CV joint, like so. Remove the washer. And this is your bearing assembly. And this is how it comes, all as one piece. It's a lot of work to actually take out the individual bearing, disassemble it all and put in a new one. And that requires specialist tools. To buy the complete bearing assembly is a relatively cheap item, and it makes the job much easier. So I would suggest, rather than trying to save a couple of dollars by just buying a bearing, just buy the whole hub assembly. And if you can't get them cheap, I don't like to push my forum too much, but you can get them quite cheaply on my channel as well. Now, this particular version is from the early car models, and from now on you can't get this version anymore. The newer upgraded version will fit all models with a 4-wheel drive, and that comes looking like this. Now, on the top it's exactly the same, but if I turn it sideways you'll see there's a slight difference in that the old version has the bolts permanently fitted to the hub assembly, and if you damage any of those bolts they're very, very difficult to replace. With the newer version you have 4 additional bolts that come through from this side, so it's screwed from the back instead, and if you damage or lose any of those bolts they're very easy to replace. Other than that, everything else is exactly the same. It will fit into the hub exactly the same, and you know, it's pretty much the same job. So now we've had a look at what you're doing and how it goes together. Next job is to look at the tools we're going to be needing. Now here's a selection of the tools we're going to need today. Depending on how the job goes, we may not need all of these tools, or we may need to add some additional tools if it goes really badly. The problem with the area that we're working in is, and the country that you live in, is some of the parts can become heavily rusted into the place that they're mounted, and then we have to go to the more violent means to get those apart. Hopefully it won't be that bad today. So a brief look at what we need. If you haven't seen one of these before, this is a new tool that I've been using, quite a cheap tool. It allows us to screw onto the hub and then pull the hub off, and it has a few other uses as well around the wheel area. So we're going to be using that today. We may need a good heavy duty club hammer. You're going to need your Pitman arm puller, another semi-specialist tool, but these are now really, really cheap. You can get them from your local auto parts store for $10–15, a worthwhile investment for the damage that it can save you. This here is out of a bush pulling set. I may need to use this if it's seized in there. We're going to combine this with a slide hammer to try and yank that hub assembly out. Then we need a 3/8 drive wrench with a 12mm socket piece on the end, a spanner, maybe a couple of spanners, 17 and 19mm may be needed, some sort of plier or some sort of tool to yank out the split pin. A couple of bungee straps are going to come in handy, a 1/2" drive wrench, and onto that you're going to need a suitable tool for your wheel nuts, depending on which size wheel nuts you have. You're going to need a 17mm socket piece, a 19mm socket piece, and I believe the big one, but the printer's come off it, is 32mm for the big nut in the middle. You may well need a breaker bar. In fact, you'll almost certainly need a breaker bar to undo your wheel nuts and some of the other heavy duty stuff. And finally, I've got a big old crowbar here. I'll show you what that's for as we go along. It's just a method I use to get some of the stuff undone. So that's a look at the tools. Now let's get on with the job. Today we're going to be doing this job on this red twin turbo model. Now you may notice straight away that the front wing has been removed, as has the plastic inner arches. Now they've purely been removed in order to aid the filming of this video. You do not need to remove those items in order to do this job. The next thing I want to point out is if you look in the manual, Mitsubishi tell you that before you jack the car, you should remove the hub nut on the end. Now you can't actually do that. The manual, I hate to say, is wrong in this case, because if we look in the center here, here's the nut you need to remove. But the problem is with the wheel on the car, you cannot get that split pin out in order to get the nut out, not unless you start cutting it up. So we're going to jack the car first, as I've already done for this one in preparation, and remove the wheel. And again, to save time, I'm assured that you all know how to remove the wheel on your car. So I'll just quickly grab these last couple of nuts out.
Just while we're doing that, the hub on the SL, or at least your SL, was slightly different.
Yes, this is purely the four-wheel drive model that we're doing. The SL is completely different. The front wheel drive only is completely different, and we'll be covering that in another video. So with the wheel removed, let's get the job started. First off, we're going to disconnect the ABS sensor cables and the brake hose lines. This is so that we don't put any strain on them when we start removing some of the heavier parts. So for that, you'll need your 12mm wrench. For the ABS sensor, I prefer to undo this nut here in the middle rather than the one around the side here. The reason is, if this bolt is really rusted, it's going to twist up all the metal that it's mounted on. Whereas the one that goes straight into the strut is a much more substantial thing that shouldn't bend or move. I'm already wishing I'd got an extension on this just to make the job a bit easier. We'll put the nut back on there. That keeps it out the way and we know where everything goes. Now if you follow this bracket here, from either side, this one here, round the back there is a bolt. Again, it's a 12mm head. You can turn your steering if you're able to, but I can't on this one because it's been locked off. And that's going to give me a problem. Hope that's not tight. Right, just give me a second. We're on to some fresh tools already. So I decided not to get some more tools. That would be unfair. What I've actually done now is taken the steering lock off, turned the steering. Now we can get the wrench in the back there. Okay, so there's your little bolt. I'll put that back in the hole again so we don't lose it. Now we've got the freedom to remove the brake calipers. And for that, I believe that was 17mm around the back there. You've got two bolts you need to undo. There's one just here, and then there's one right down the bottom, if you can see in there. Now these are generally very, very tight, so make sure you can get a good wrenching angle on there. If not, you'll need to get your breaker bar on it. That's the first one, and then the one down the bottom. I'm going to go for a spanner on this one. It's a little bit tight on space for the wrench. Damn, that's tight. I'll be honest, this is a relatively clean car, so I didn't expect any of these parts to be quite so tight. Now, I'm going to get a ratchet spanner to speed things up. Give me a second. With Christmas coming up soon, if you're looking for some new tools to buy, these ratchet spanners are really, really good because, as you can see, messing around with a single fixed head spanner takes time bit by bit by bit. You can use these much quicker. Just get them on the head of the bolt. It works the same as your regular wrench, but now you don't have to take the spanner off. You can get the job done much quicker. And the good thing is a lot of these tools are no longer expensive. They used to be considered professional tools, but you can now get them from your general store for next to nothing really. Time for your bungee cable. Knock your brake calipers off. These haven't turned in quite some time, so they're slightly fixed on there. Get your bungee cable through the middle, or however you wish to fix it up. No, not through the middle on that one. Just find somewhere safe to hook it out the way. Okay, let's give us a bit better working space. Now you'll notice this one's actually got the brake dust cover on. A lot of you have upgraded your brakes to a bigger unit, and that means you have to remove this dust cover. I'd strongly recommend not doing that unless you absolutely have to, because by removing this it allows a lot more water and muck to get into your main assembly, to your bearings. It creates more wear and tear. Not necessary in most cases unless you're going high performance racing. Now we're going to remove the brake disc. Generally speaking, these are pulled straight off. If you get one that's really tight, you can give it a good bash. That will often free it up. But in a worst case scenario, if you can't get it undone, get yourself a couple of 8mm bolts, screw them into these screw holes, bit by bit, just do each one up, little bit at a time, and that will knock that off for you. These are quite heavy, watch you don't drop them on your fingers. Now we're on to the next bit. We need to get this big nut undone. First of all, we've got to remove the split pin that stops the nut working loose. For that, a little pair of needle nose pliers, but you might want to use something else. Just pull it out. Some people like to go overboard on these. As far as I'm concerned, as long as the end is open enough to stop it coming out, that's all you need to do. Some people bend them all over in elaborate ways, and they're a real pig to get off when you need to get them off. So just pull that pin out. Now we're on to the nut, and here's what I wanted this big pry bar for. This allows me to lock the main hub assembly to stop it turning while I'm trying to undo the nut. Now these bolts here are high tensile steel. You're not going to break or damage them by doing what I'm going to show you to do. If you put this between a couple of these wheel nuts at just the right angle, I think this has been left in gear, that will stop the wheel turning. Now what we can do, I'm pretty sure this was 32mm, get that on there. Now this is going to be done up really tight usually, but not this one because this is a car I'm working on. So that was lucky, that come undone quite easily. So that's your nut, and if we can get it off at this point, the washer, and we don't lose it. Now as you noticed earlier, we've got to remove the main drive shaft from the centre, but we can't do that without releasing the hub from the steering and from the suspension. Sometimes you can do it just from the suspension, but the problem is we've got to get right behind to do a lot of work. So at this point I've decided it's better to remove the steering and the suspension all at the same time. Ordinarily your steering arm would have had a split pin through as well, For some reason this one is missing, and you may also have noticed that this one is split, so I'll be fitting a new one of these in another video. Now we've got to undo this nut on the top here. I believe that was 19, yes. Now if you've ever replaced this, different aftermarket manufacturers use different size nuts, and some of them are locking nuts and some require a split pin. I personally prefer the type that needs a split pin. Now I've heard people on the forums, and I think on my YouTube channel as well, because I used the Pitman arm puller to get these apart, and people were saying, well, you can do it cheaper if you just hit the top there with a hammer. Yes you can, and I'll be honest, in many years past, especially in my younger years, that was the technique I used. But I think anyone who's used that technique will agree with me that quite often you damage the thread, and unless you're going to be replacing that ball joint anyway, it's better not to bash it. I'm sure I paid about £12, £10 for this tool. They're not expensive at all now from your regular auto parts store. So just grab yourself one of these. You're going to be needing it on lots and lots of different joints over the years. And I always say to people, think about how much you're going to be saving on the job by doing the job yourself. And secondly, the biggest saving of all is how much you're going to save by not doing damage to parts by releasing them with the proper tool. So we slip that in there. Whoops, too far. Oh, that one come out automatically. Ordinarily, you'd slip that over the knuckle, screw this down like so, and eventually it will pop that out for you. That was a bit easier than I expected. Now we can take this out. Now we're going to release it from the main strut. For that you need two 17mm tools. Now I'm going to use one spanner and a 17mm wrench. You know what else I should have mentioned? Just cut the video a second, I'm going to get something else. Now one of the things I forgot to mention is grab yourself a white marker or some Tipp-Ex or anything that will allow you to mark accurately where something was. This bolt here controls the tracking of your wheels to make sure you're going in a straight line and it doesn't wear your tyres properly. If your tracking is fine, then, well actually it's camber not tracking, but if everything's running fine, to save yourself money and getting a garage to realign it all for you, just mark how it was all set up before you took it apart, and then you can put it back in exactly the same settings. So you'll need a marking in two places. One is on the strut itself, and one is on the bolt that is adjustable. And as long as you've got that marking accurate, you're going to be able to put it back together without any problems. The bottom one doesn't matter so much because that's not adjustable, it's only the top one that adjusts. So let's have another go at undoing these. Now ordinarily these are going to be done up really tight. I'm really having a bad day for remembering the tools, so I need to get that extension in a second. That's the top one. is the bottom one. Wiggle it around and the bolts will come out if they're not rusted in. Okay, now we can separate from the strut, and now we have lots of flexibility. Just for one final thing, to give us that final little bit of extra movement, what we can do is undo this one here, assuming it's not too rusted in. Sometimes they rust in so badly that you risk damaging this metal bracket. So if that's the case, then just leave it where it is. No, and that's it, doing exactly what I was afraid it would do. So I'm going to leave that for now, and then I'll get some penetrating fluid later on to try and clean that up. Now from this point, we should now be able to pull this shaft out. And now we've got full access to everything we need to work on. These are the 4 bolts that hold your bearing hub in. And they're the next thing to undo. Now what I'm going to do now is get some penetrating oil on those, because they look pretty rusted and old and not in very good condition. So just to make the job a bit easier, we'll stick some penetrating fluid on them first and then start again. Now I've sprayed these and given them a few minutes for the penetrating oil to work. Let's see how it goes. Someone done them up really tight. Time for the breaker bar. And I had a funny feeling we might be needing this. That's one. I already loosened this one off camera just to see how tight they were.
Would it likely to do any damage to the bit at the bottom that's still
The
securing?
ball joint at the bottom? No. You think that takes a whole strain of this car bouncing up and down all day, so you're not going to be damaging that. Now we'll go back to the wrench to speed things up, I hope. This one. Okay, at this point we've got a couple of options. This is the older type hub, so we have the 4 bolts coming through from this side. And what we can do, if you're really sure you're going to dispose of this hub bearing and not reuse it, and if you don't want to spend too much money on new tools, you can just get your regular club hammer and try bashing on these bolts to knock the whole thing through. The problem with that is, once you start hitting those bolts, you're going to damage the thread and you won't be able to reuse them. You also risk the possibility of slipping and missing the bolt and catching something else that's more important to the car. So this should be a last resort. what you should really do is grab yourself a slide hammer and some of these other tools that we're going to use. There is another problem, of course. These things have spent nearly 30 years in all weathers. It's under your car, it gets wet, it gets salt from the ice on the roads, all sorts of problems, and they're usually pretty much fused in there. And a couple of times I've actually thought that this used to be all one piece and not come apart. But it is supposed to come apart, and to do that we're going to try using a slide hammer. And I've also got in here my trusty bush tool. There we go. I knew I'd get it in the end. Now this slide hammer, just the other day, typically knowing that I'm going to be filming, decided to give up on the threads. So I'm having to sort of bodge this together with whatever I've got and just hope that we manage to do this job. Actually, no, what I'm going to do, we'll start this a different way. Let's try it from the front first of all. For this, you slide this tool on here. Then you'll need your wheel nuts, and you're going to tighten them on. You're going to need 3 of them, and I've only got 2 here, so I've got to grab another nut in just a second. That's 2. Just give me a second, I know exactly where there is one. Okay, here we go, and we'll shove a 3rd one on there. I'll give it one more final spray with some more penetrating oil in the hope that we can free this without too much trouble. Okay, now we get this on here.
Given you're going to be pulling, is it worth putting a bolt into the strut?
Into the strut.
Otherwise the angling is all going to be rather difficult.
I don't know why. That should pull out fine, I think. As I say, the thread's damaged on this, so we're on to yet another tool just behind you there. Just hope this doesn't fully give up today, because then we've got a real problem. Really don't like having to cobble things together like this for the videos, but you know, I think this is just life. Sometimes things don't go as you want, and you have to make do and adapt to get the job done. Now, if this is going to go well, which I doubt, we should just be able to slam this and it'll pull that bearing out. Oh, that's looking good actually. Perfect. Well, I didn't expect that. So there we are. That's the bearing assembly pulled out. We didn't even damage it, so theoretically I could put this back in, because this is quite a good one. There's nothing actually wrong with it. I was prepared to fit a new one if we had to, but seeing as that's come out well, we'll put the same one back in. But there's a few tips I'm going to give you before we put it back together. First one, don't lose any of your washers and nuts. And I'll clean those up very quickly. Okay, now you noticed when we took that out, there's a heavy build-up of rust around here. And there will also be a heavy build-up of rust around here. Now, it's pretty important that you clean all this muck out, because when it goes to fit in the new one, you'll find the new one won't go in very easily if there's muck in there. Now, if it's just light stuff, you can just wipe it away. But if you've got any heavy build-up, which is often the case, you're going to have to get a piece of sandpaper in there and sand it all clean. And I'd strongly recommend you do that. But there's something you need to remember. I don't know if the camera can see here, but just here is the internal end of your ABS sensor. Now that sensor you're going to see has got a lot of rust and muck built up on it. And this is often the cause of ABS faults. And people get the error code to say the ABS has failed on a particular corner of the car, and they go and order a new sensor. But quite often you don't actually need a new sensor. All it is muck that's built up on there, and all you need to do is get a toothbrush and just clean it all off. And when you go to sanding any rust off from the inside here, make sure you don't accidentally sand that sensor. It's very important that you don't touch that unnecessarily. So I'm going to grab a piece of sandpaper now. I'm sure you all know how to use a piece of sandpaper, so we're not going to bother filming the sanding of it. And I'm just going to clean up inside there. Now this is a very strong metal, so you're not likely to do any damage to the metal itself. However, don't work constantly on it. Purely take away all the old rust and crud, just so the new bearing will fit back into position without doing any damage. So I'll cut the video now while I give that a quick clean up, and then we'll film again putting it back together. Now I've taken a couple of minutes with a bit of sandpaper to clean up inside this hub assembly here. I've also taken the time while it's apart, and I'd recommend this for all of you. Whenever you're doing any of these jobs, do a little bit of preventative maintenance as well. It doesn't hurt while you're underneath to just get the brush out and clean out some muck. Maybe any bolts that are a bit rusted up, you could put something on those to protect them. And generally just look after your car, because remember, these cars are older than most of us are, and they need a little bit of TLC as they get into their older years. And that little bit of TLC is going to pay off long into the future, because while some are going to be rusting away, others will be there for you if you just look after them. I've also made the decision that because this is a restoration car, the same as the black one, I'm going to put in new wheel bearings anyway, just for the sake of it. It just means that whoever decides to buy this car when it's finished, they're getting every single part absolutely new and mint condition. It's going to have a beautiful respray, just like at the factory, not one of these things that you get done down the road. And they're going to be getting a fantastic car. So let's look at putting in the new wheel bearing. As I said, the old type with the bolts that come out of the ends are no longer available. The newer type fits just as well onto the older cars. Now you'll notice with the hole spacings on these, it's narrower across those two than it is across those two. So when you go to putting it back in, you've got to make sure you line up the 4 holes correctly. Now it's not likely to go straight in, it's a machined perfect fit. Sometimes they'll go in part way, sometimes they won't. Right, so it's gone in a little bit. Then you need your 4 bolts. Now depending on where you buy your bearing from, whether it's an original Mitsubishi part or an aftermarket part, is irrelevant. Some of them will come with new bolts and washers, some of them you'll have to get your own bolts and washers. So these are high tensile. Always use high tensile if you're having to get them yourself. And as I've been saying about preventative, in the UK here we have copper anti-seize grease. It's basically a bearing grease, but it's got a copper powder mixed into it to stop bolts rusting and seizing. So I'm just going to put a little bit of that onto the thread. It means that if we ever have to take this apart again, it'll come apart really easily rather than have the bolts rusted up. So we're sticking our first bolt, make sure all the holes are lined up, which in this case are not, so I'm going to have to pull that back out again, line up the bolt and then get it back in again. Now never try to do that first bolt up straight away. Get all 4 bolts into position first. If you try to do up just 1 bolt at a time, what's going to happen is it's going to pull the thing out of alignment and you're going to end up doing damage. So be patient, 1 bolt at a time, and then we'll look at doing them all up. That's our second one. Now I've asked for this copper grease when I've been working on cars in other countries, and the store people looked at me like I'm crazy, so I'm guessing this isn't available in all countries. I was told that in some countries you use silicone grease, and if that works for you, well then use that. I'm guessing it must work, but I'm quite happy with this stuff. I don't like using silicone around cars, especially if you're planning on doing any spraying, because that silicone does not go well with paint. Now when it comes to screwing this up, make sure you keep an eye on the gap between the 2 parts. You need to screw it in so it goes in perfectly level all the way, and that's going to mean swapping from bolt to bolt, a little bit at a time. A bit of muck got in there. So let's have a wrench. And then if we go in opposite corners, it will hopefully pull it in just right. To this one. Now be patient with it, it is a precision item, there's no need to rush it because you will get it wrong. Okay, now we can get the other 2 done up. Now these are high tensile, you see how tight they was when we took them out, so you know for sure that you can do them up really tight when you put them back in. Okay, now we can put the drive shaft back in. Line everything up, that slides in nice and easy. Onto the end there goes our washer and our nut. Now just a tip, when these are new, because the grease is packed really tightly into the bearings, it's going to seem that this is quite stiff to turn. The bearing I'm on about now, I've put the shaft in there and I think it's in gear. It's difficult to tell, but that's quite normal for it to be quite sluggish with the thick grease in there. With age that will start to wear down a little bit, but it's perfectly normal and as it should be. Now we've got to tighten up that middle wheel nut, and to do that we're going to need a big old pry bar back to lock off the wheel. Actually, before I do that, let's get some of this other stuff back on. Get the suspension arm in. We've got 2 bolts. One has our marking on, which goes into the top. And the bottom one. Now I've noticed on some cars the bolts are going through from the back, on others are going through from the front. It makes no difference because the markings for setting them up are on both sides. Now there should actually be a couple of washers on here. I'm pretty sure there should be some washers on here. For some reason they're not on here. Don't worry about it right now for this one, because I'm going to be stripping all this down again and putting all new stuff on here, so that's not of any importance right now. Next up, we're going to put on the brake disc and brake calipers. Just before we do that, I wanted to explain to you something very, very important. Any flat mating surface must be clean. It's quite common for people to go and get the tracking, the alignment on their wheels redone because their tyres are wearing unevenly. And quite often this is nothing to do with the tracking itself. It's because muck has built up somewhere, or they've had a wheel off and not noticed when they've put it back on, a stone or some piece of muck has been trapped inside. And of course, instead of running flat, it's put it slightly at one angle. So always check all of your flat mating surfaces are clean and free from any heavy rust build-up or any mud or stones or anything else. They should be perfectly smooth. Regardless of what they look like, they need to be smooth. So you can get those back on. And from here we can put on our brake caliper. Just check all your lines around the right way as they should be, rather than twisted upside down or anything. Slide that over your brake disc. And line up your wheels behind. Once again, a little bit of copper grease or silicone grease, whatever you decide to use. On the bolts, you remember we had a lot of trouble getting these out because they'd rusted on. So we'll just put some grease on the thread to make the job easier for the future. Now, of course, your brakes are very important, so always make sure you do them up nice and tight. Okay. And we have our nut here. I think I'm going to do the one around the back first. And we can turn this and make the job a bit easier. For those of you that are turning in to the little home mechanic that have decided you're not going to stick with just the one quick job, you're going to continue doing as much on your car as possible, just keep an ear out for all these little tips I'm giving you, because they're really useful regardless of what job you decide to do. Things like cleaning your flat mating surfaces and preventative maintenance with greasing and oiling and protecting the threads and stuff from any future rust, because as these parts become more and more rare and obsolete, it's only the ones that have been properly maintained that will continue going into the future. I'm seeing so many of these cars now that are so rotten, and it's purely because they weren't looked after properly. Okay, now we can do up those two camber bolts. That's the wrong size. There we go. And I went and got myself a little extension as well to make the job a bit easier this time. Now we're not going to do up the bottom one first, not tightly anyway. We're going to adjust the camber first into its correct position, tighten that one up, and then we'll come back to the bottom one. So all I'm doing at the moment is just bringing the nut up, ready for tightening. There we go. Now remember your marking on there that you put on. With any luck, you won't have to get any of your camber reset because you left that mark on there.
Watch out, you've lifted it up.
Yeah. That's about it. Okay, and with the bottom one, we can now do up fully. And finally, I think, is the steering arm. Push that up in there. As I say, this particular type of nut, castle nut, should have a split pin through it, but I've not got one on me right now, and we're going to be replacing this track rod arm, so I'll put in the new one when I do that at the same time. And the final thing is to do up this centre bolt. Now this one does have to be done up really tight. You are not going to clamp the bearings or do any damage. I know on the older cars where the bearing was in two separate pieces, if you did it up too tight it stopped the wheel turning. These are different. You can do them up as tight as you can and it won't make any difference at all. They're a machined part. So we'll lock off the wheel. Get the breaker bar on there. And we're going to need one of the split pin holes lined up. There's 2 split pin holes and one is at a slightly different angle to the other, so you should be able to get one of them to line up. There we go. Split pin through, open it up a little bit, or if you prefer, if you're one of the people that like to fold it all the way over, you can do that, but for me that's good enough. It's not going to come out, it's going to do the job that it's designed to do. So that's it. All we've got to do now is put on the wheel. I'm not going to do that at the moment because you all know how to put on a wheel and I don't want to use up video time on just putting on a wheel. So for now, that video is completed. Hopefully you've learnt from this. I hope it's of use to you. Don't forget to give us a like or a thumbs up on the YouTube channel and leave a comment if you would like to. And if you feel so inclined, pop along to my little forum and you can ask questions and talk to other people about videos that I've done on the channel. I have a few parts on there that I sell off cheap when I've got them, that are surplus to my needs, and maybe you've got something you would like to sell or share with someone else. So for now, thanks for watching and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next video.